Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. An F-4U Corsair thundered across the sky at nearly 400 miles an hour, its wings slicing the gray clouds as if the heavens themselves were being torn open. Below, the sea was alive with steel. Hundreds of landing craft churned the Pacific waters, their bows biting through the surf as they converged on a narrow strip of coastline made of something strange. Black volcanic sand that shimmered like ground obsidian. In one of those cramped vessels, a 19-year-old Marine gripped the side rail, knuckles pale, the salt spray mingling with sweat on his brow. He had been told of tropical islands, of palm trees, of warm breezes, but Iwo Jima was no paradise. To his left rose the dark silhouette of Mount Suribachi, a jagged peak that loomed over the beach like a watchful sentinel. For 3 relentless days, that mountain and the island beneath it had been pounded by the guns of battleships and the bombs of aircraft. Each explosion had lit up the horizon with fire, a terrible fireworks show of American power. And yet, deep inside, the young Marine could not shake the gnawing thought. What if something survived? What if someone was waiting? Behind him, the armada stretched to the horizon, an entire fleet at war. Battleships, cruisers, carriers, and destroyers filled the sea, their guns still rumbling like a distant thunderstorm. It was said that no island in history had ever endured such a bombardment. The Marine tried to believe it meant safety, that nothing could possibly remain alive on that cursed spit of land. Still, doubt whispered to him. This was not just another island. By 1945, the Americans had clawed their way across the Pacific, taking at great cost the Marianas, Peleliu, and the Philippines. Each battle had been bloodier than the last. Iwo Jima was different. It lay between the Marianas and the Japanese homeland, a fortress that could threaten American bombers on their way to Tokyo. And now, it was the Marines' task to wrench it from the hands of men sworn to die rather than surrender. As the landing craft neared the shore, the noise of bombardment seemed almost to recede into a strange silence, broken only by the crash of waves and the droning engines. The Marines glanced at one another, faces pale, helmets heavy, rifles slick with sea spray. Some whispered prayers, others forced down dry gulps of air. No fire greeted them, no bullets cracked. It felt uncanny, as though the island itself was holding its breath. On the horizon, Suribachi towered higher, its volcanic cliffs scarred and blackened, yet unbroken. The Marines stared up at it, shivering though the air was warm. It was not just a mountain, it was a warning. Every man could feel it in his gut. This was not going to be easy. The landing craft ground forward, its steel hull scraping against the shallows. The ramp would fall any moment. In the stillness, the young Marine had time for a single thought. If they survived the storm of steel from their own fleet, what horrors must lie beneath that mountain waiting? The ramp clattered down. The black sands of Iwo Jima had opened their jaws. By late 1944, Japan's empire was crumbling like a sandcastle battered by waves. What only 3 years earlier had stretched triumphantly across the Pacific was now being pulled apart, island by American forces. The fall of the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, had pierced the outer ring of Japan's defenses. From those islands, American B-29 bombers could now reach the heart of the Japanese homeland. Tokyo itself trembled beneath their shadows. The loss of the Marianas was more than territory. It was a psychic wound. Newspapers in Japan were forced to announce what had once been unthinkable, that American planes could now bomb the emperor's capital. For ordinary citizens, it meant nights spent huddled in shelters as the drone of bombers grew louder above their wooden homes. For Japan's generals, it meant the clock was ticking. The homeland was vulnerable. It was in this desperate moment that Iwo Jima took on an importance far greater than its size. Barely 8 square miles of volcanic rock, the island seemed insignificant on a map, but it sat like a dagger pointed at the routes between the Marianas and Japan. American bombers had to fly directly over it, and Japanese radar stations on the island could warn Tokyo hours in advance of incoming raids. Worse still, Japanese fighters stationed there could pounce on the lumbering B-29s as they passed. For the Americans, capturing Iwo Jima promised a double advantage. First, it would strip Japan of its early warning system and cripple its ability to intercept raids. Second, it would provide something desperately needed, an emergency landing strip for the massive B-29s. These bombers often returned crippled from their missions, engines smoking, wings shredded, crews barely alive. Thousands of men might be saved if they had a place to land before reaching the Marianas. But beyond strategy lay psychology. Each island closer to Japan carried a message. The homeland was not untouchable. The empire was not eternal. For Japanese leaders, defending Iwo Jima was not simply about geography. It was about preserving honor, about showing the world that the spirit of the nation remained unbroken. American commanders understood this too. They knew the fight ahead would be brutal. The experience of Peleliu, where Marines had expected a short campaign but were dragged into 2 months of slaughter, lingered heavily in their minds. Still, the Joint Chiefs believed Iwo Jima had to be taken, whatever the cost. As February 1945 approached, the fate of a tiny volcanic island would decide more than the survival of bombers. It would determine how close the war would come to Japan's own shores, and how many lives would be sacrificed on the black sands of Iwo Jima. The man chosen to defend Iwo Jima was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, a soldier unlike many of his peers. Born in Nagano Prefecture, he had studied in America during the 1920s as a military attaché. He had driven across the United States, met American families, even written letters home about the vast resources and industrial power of his future enemy. "If Japan ever fights America," he once confided, "we will lose." And yet, years later, it fell to him to hold an island against that same unstoppable force. Kuribayashi knew Iwo Jima could not be saved. His task was not to win, it was to bleed the Americans so severely that the very thought of invading Japan itself would be haunted by the memory of the carnage. To his men, he declared, "We are here to defend this island to the limit of our strength. If our positions are overrun, we will take bombs and grenades and throw ourselves under the tanks to destroy them. Long live the Emperor." But unlike many Japanese commanders, Kuribayashi forbade the reckless banzai charges that had wasted thousands of lives in earlier battles. He saw them as useless sacrifices, eruptions of courage that achieved little but early death. Instead, he insisted on discipline, endurance, and innovation. His defense would be methodical, not suicidal. He ordered his engineers to burrow into the earth. By the time the battle began, they had carved nearly 19,000 yards of tunnels, passages that linked caves, bunkers, command posts, and artillery chambers. Some tunnels were small dugouts for a squad, others vast caverns capable of holding hundreds of men. They had food and water, hidden hospitals, and communications lines. The island itself became a subterranean fortress, immune to the storm of American bombs. Kuribayashi also deployed his few tanks and anti-tank guns with cunning precision. Knowing they would never survive in the open, he embedded them into the volcanic rock, disguising their barrels and camouflaging their positions. Even the 23 Type 95 light tanks were converted into static pillboxes, waiting like iron jaws for the invaders. Every soldier under his command understood that they would not leave Iwo Jima alive. Letters written by officers and conscripts alike were laced with a haunting mix of fatalism and pride. Some spoke of families they would never see again. Others promised to die gloriously for the emperor. Yet Kuribayashi himself often wrote to his wife and children in quiet, tender words. He missed his daughter's violin recitals. He worried about his son's future. Behind the iron resolve was a man who knew exactly what his sacrifice meant. When the sun rose on Iwo Jima in February 1945, 21,000 Japanese soldiers waited underground, bound by Kuribayashi's oath. Their mission was not victory. It was to make every yard of black sand cost the Americans more blood than they could bear. Beneath the desolate volcanic surface of Iwo Jima, a hidden world had been carved with ruthless precision. For nearly a year before the American invasion, thousands of Japanese soldiers labored with pick, shovel, and dynamite, transforming the island into something that resembled a termite colony of war. When American reconnaissance planes flew overhead, they saw little more than black sand, jagged ridges, and the brooding peak of Mount Suribachi. What they could not see was the vast network beneath their gaze. Caves honeycombed the cliffs, tunnels linked strong points across the island, and hidden chambers served as barracks, hospitals, and command posts. By February 1945, Kuribayashi's men had excavated over 19,000 yards of tunnel, enough to run from one end of Manhattan to the other. Some chambers were scarcely large enough for a handful of soldiers crouched in the dark, their rifles propped beside them. Others were cavernous, big enough to hold an entire battalion, or to conceal artillery pieces that could be rolled into firing positions and withdrawn before counterfire arrived. Air shafts and cleverly disguised entrances allowed smoke from cooking fires or gun blasts to dissipate without betraying their position. It was a fortress built not upwards into the sky, but downward into the earth. The Japanese command understood they could not match American firepower. The Navy's battleships could hurl shells heavier than cars, and B-24 bombers had already dropped thousands of tons of ordnance. So instead of defending the beaches in the open, Kuribayashi designed a strategy of endurance. He knew the Americans would come ashore. He would let them. And then, from the hidden mouths of his tunnels, his men would unleash a storm of fire. Even the island's tanks, 23 Type 95s, fragile and outdated compared to the American Shermans, were turned into concealed bunkers. Their turrets were buried in sand and reinforced with concrete, their barrels aimed like silent traps at landing zones. Heavy machine guns and mortars were mounted in pillboxes that seemed to disappear into the volcanic landscape. 70 anti-tank guns were placed in overlapping fields of fire, designed to shred any attempt at armored advance. Kuribayashi's design was more than military pragmatism. It carried cultural weight. To the Japanese soldier, to be unseen, waiting underground, was to embrace patience and death in equal measure. The tunnels became wombs of sacrifice, places where letters home were written by candlelight, where men sang old songs of the homeland before sealing themselves into darkness, ready to fight to the last. For the Americans, accustomed to battles where naval and aerial bombardments cleared defenders off beaches, Iwo Jima would present a shock. They would land on sand that seemed strangely empty, only to discover that the real battle waited beneath their feet. Kuribayashi had not just built fortifications. He had built a trap, one that would force the Marines into the black heart of Iwo Jima itself. On the other side of the Pacific, the American invasion force gathered with a confidence born from overwhelming strength. At its head was Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the architect of the island-hopping campaign that had carried the U.S. Navy from Pearl Harbor's ashes to the doorstep of Japan itself. The task of seizing Iwo Jima fell to Major General Harry Schmidt and his V Amphibious Corps, 80,000 Marines, the largest amphibious landing force yet assembled in the Pacific. The plan seemed straightforward on paper. The 4th Marine Division would land on the right flank, the 5th Marine Division on the left, side by side on Iwo Jima's southeastern beaches. Their objective? Pivot north, cutting the island in two, and then rolling up the defenses from south to north. Meanwhile, a regiment from the 5th Marines would storm Mount Suribachi, that volcanic dagger rising nearly 550 feet above the shoreline. The 3rd Marine Division would remain in reserve, ready to exploit breakthroughs or reinforce bloodied regiments. The blueprint was bold, but behind it lurked the eternal truth of war. No plan survives contact with the enemy. General Schmidt had requested a 10-day naval bombardment to prepare the ground, reduce the bunkers, and smash the tunnels. It was a request born from bitter experience. Peleliu, where 3 days of shelling had proven disastrously inadequate. Yet once again, High Command denied him. He would receive only 3 days of naval and aerial fire. From the decks of battleships, gunners swore that no living thing could survive the hurricane of steel they unleashed. "The island is a tomb," one sailor remarked, watching the landscape erupt into fire. But Kuribayashi's men were not on the surface. They were deep underground, untouched, waiting. The American faith in bombardment had blinded them to the reality of the fortress hidden beneath the black sand. For the Marines, Iwo Jima was meant to be another island in a bloody but predictable chain. They had fought through coral atolls, dense jungles, and ridges drenched in blood. They believed this landing would be no different. A furious fight, yes, but one that could be contained and completed within a week. Some officers privately whispered doubts. They had seen what Japanese ingenuity and fanaticism could accomplish on Peleliu and Tarawa. But orders were orders, and the Marines, boys from Kansas farms, New York streets, and California coasts, prepared to face yet another island that most had never heard of until weeks before. As the fleet closed in on Iwo Jima on February 18, 1945, the Marines studied maps that showed beaches marked in bright colors: green, red, yellow, blue, each designating where their divisions would land. On paper, it looked almost clinical, like a chessboard maneuver. In reality, those colored strips were narrow kill zones of volcanic ash, watched over by an enemy who had been preparing for this moment for nearly a year. At dawn the next day, the Marines would go ashore. They would discover too late that the bombardment had done little, that the beach was no chessboard, and that the Japanese defense was unlike anything they had faced before. At 8:59 a.m. on February 19, 1945, the first wave of Marines clambered down into the surf. Boots hit the black water, rifles held high, hearts thundering. All around them, the horizon was aflame with the thunder of the fleet. Battleships loosed final salvos, their guns cracking the sky. Destroyers raked the shoreline with streams of fire. To the Marines, it seemed impossible that anything could still be alive on that shattered island. And yet, as their landing craft ground into the volcanic sand, a strange calm fell. No machine guns opened fire, no mortars burst overhead. The beach seemed eerily silent except for the crash of surf and the roar of engines. Some Marines dared to believe the bombardment had wiped out the defenders. Others, hardened by earlier campaigns, felt the unease crawl along their spines. The Japanese were out there. They were always out there. By 9:30 a.m., the beach was alive with activity. Amphibious tractors and LCVPs unloaded Marines in wave after wave. Trucks, jeeps, and tanks rolled onto the sand, bogging down almost immediately in the loose volcanic ash that sucked at their treads like quicksand. Men tried to dig foxholes, only to discover the sand offered no real protection, crumbling in their hands. Still, they pushed forward inch by inch toward the jagged interior. Then, shortly after 10 a.m., the trap was sprung. From Mount Suribachi to the northern ridges, hidden artillery roared to life. The entire island erupted in flame and smoke as Japanese mortars, machine guns, and heavy cannon opened fire in unison. Kuribayashi's plan had been revealed. Wait until the beaches were choked with men and machines, then strike with every weapon at once. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Landing zones became killing grounds. Shells fell like hammer blows, tearing apart tanks and men alike. Marines dived for cover in the open sand, clawing desperately at the ash, trying to vanish into it, but the earth refused them. Machine gun bursts cut down squads as they struggled to advance. Mortar shells whistled overhead before slamming into the clustered landing craft, igniting fuel and ammunition. Derek Wright, in Iwo Jima, 1945, would later describe it as a nightmarish bloodbath. One Marine remembered the beach as a charnel house in black sand, where every movement seemed to draw fire from an unseen gun. In the chaos, men clung to survival with raw instinct. Some dragged the wounded into shallow trenches scratched from ash. Others tried to push inland, only to be driven back by interlocking fields of fire. Still others froze, pinned beneath the storm, praying only to see nightfall. And yet, amidst the horror, they did not break. Bulldozers of the Navy's Seabees rumbled ashore, blades shoving sand into makeshift roads and embankments, even as bullets snapped around them. Officers rallied scattered groups, pointing them inland. Slowly, painfully, the Marines began to crawl forward, each foot gained at a cost of blood. For the Japanese, it was the fulfillment of Kuribayashi's oath. For the Americans, it was the realization of a grim truth. Iwo Jima would not be taken in days. It would not be taken without sacrifice. The beach that morning had become the threshold of hell, and the battle had only just begun. The Marines soon discovered that Iwo Jima itself was as much an enemy as the men hiding beneath it. The volcanic ash, black and coarse as ground glass, refused to yield. It swallowed boots to the ankle, bogged down tanks and jeeps, and crumbled whenever men tried to dig in for cover. A rifleman could scrape for minutes with his entrenching tool, only to find himself lying in a shallow depression, still exposed to machine gun fire. "The sand ate men alive," one survivor later wrote. Progress inland was painfully slow. Marines could advance only a few feet at a time, hurling themselves into the ash, waiting for the next burst of fire, then inching forward again. The heat rising from the ground made every breath a labor, the black grit clinging to sweat and stinging eyes. Those who stumbled often vanished in sudden bursts of mortar fire, their bodies instantly coated with a fine layer of volcanic dust. And still, the Japanese fired on. Hidden in pillboxes and cave mouths invisible to the naked eye, their machine guns cut arcs of death across the beach. Mortars and artillery shells rained down with uncanny accuracy, guided by observers peering from Mount Suribachi's slopes. Every step forward felt like a gamble against fate. The Navy's Seabees worked miracles under fire. Their bulldozers clawed crude roads across the sand, allowing tanks and supply trucks to edge forward. Yet even the great Shermans, designed to grind through Europe's mud, stalled helplessly in Iwo Jima's ash. Crews abandoned them under fire, only to see their steel hulks erupt in flames when struck by Japanese shells. Despite everything, the Marines pushed on. By midday, some elements of the assault had reached Airfield No. 1, a flat, blasted strip in the island's interior. Others managed to cut across the island at its narrowest point, reaching the far shore by late afternoon. These gains were small miracles in a day otherwise filled with suffering. Not all Marines were so fortunate. On the right flank, the 25th Regiment of the 4th Marine Division advanced toward a fortified strongpoint known simply as the Quarry. There, the Japanese defense revealed its true ferocity. Caves honeycombed the cliffs, each manned by soldiers who had survived the bombardment untouched. Crossfire swept every approach, mortar shells falling like iron hail. By nightfall, of the 900 men who had charged toward the quarry that morning, only 150 were still in fighting condition, an appalling casualty rate of more than 80%. Entire companies were reduced to handfuls of survivors. The wounded lay scattered across the volcanic ground, many unable to be evacuated under the relentless fire. Darkness brought no relief. The black ash still clung, the smell of cordite and burning flesh heavy in the air. The Marines dug shallow foxholes, knowing they were little more than symbolic gestures against the steel that would fall again at dawn. Exhausted men whispered to one another in the dark, some speaking of home, others sitting in silence, eyes fixed on the invisible mountain that loomed above. The first day had ended, and already the scale of the fight was clear. Iwo Jima was not just another stepping stone. It was a nightmare landscape designed to grind down flesh and spirit alike. For the Americans, survival itself felt like victory. For the Japanese, the quarry was proof that their underground fortress still lived, untouched, and that their general's plan was unfolding exactly as intended. By the end of February 19th, the beaches of Iwo Jima were a vision of hell, strewn with burning tanks, shattered landing craft, and men digging shallow pits in the ash to shield themselves from the relentless storm. And yet, in that crucible of fire, the Marines did not break. Nearly 30,000 of them had clawed their way ashore by nightfall, battered but alive, anchoring the tenuous foothold that would become their lifeline. The Japanese defense, though devastating, had not succeeded in driving them back into the sea. Kuribayashi had never intended to. His strategy was to let them land, to let the weight of the invasion press deeper inland, so that his fortress could bleed them slowly, methodically, without pause. The Marines quickly discovered that even when they seized a bunker or trench, the victory was an illusion. At night, Japanese soldiers slipped through hidden tunnels, re-emerging in positions the Americans thought secured. A pillbox destroyed by flamethrower in the afternoon might blaze with machine gun fire again by dawn. It was like fighting ghosts who melted into the earth itself. Against this nightmare, the Marines adapted. Flamethrowers became their most valued weapon, the pressurized flames spearing into dark caves and suffocating oxygen from chambers. Grenades were hurled into every crevice, followed by tense moments of silence, then the dull thump of explosions echoing underground. Tanks were fitted with flamethrower equipment, their steel hulks crawling forward to bathe cliffsides in fire. The Seabees, Navy construction battalions, earned legendary status. Under machine gun fire, their bulldozers gouged paths through the ash, clearing wrecks and pushing up berms to shelter advancing infantry. One Seabee crew filled in a crater while shells burst around them, refusing to stop until the road was made passable. To the Marines slogging forward, these men were lifelines, their blades and grit carving order into chaos. Still, the toll was staggering. Casualty reports mounted by the hour. Entire platoons were reduced to a handful of survivors. Corpsmen worked tirelessly, dragging the wounded through fields of fire, their Red Cross armbands no shield against Japanese bullets. In makeshift aid stations on the beach, surgeons worked by lantern light, their hands red, their ears filled with the ceaseless thunder of guns. Yet morale endured. Letters later written by Marines spoke of exhaustion, but also of an unshakable resolve. "We couldn't go back," one man remembered, "so we went forward." Inch by inch, crater by crater, the Americans dug into the island, matching Japanese endurance with their own. By the third day, elements of the 3rd Marine Division were pulled from reserve and thrust into the fight. Fresh troops trudged up the beach under fire, their faces pale as they passed the wreckage of their brother's first assault. They carried with them no illusions. This was no quick victory. Iwo Jima would be taken only through fire, and the fire was only beginning. In the battles of Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, American Marines had grown accustomed to a certain rhythm, a furious defense at the beachhead, followed by wild banzai charges, desperate rushes of sword and rifle, shouted to the last breath. These suicidal assaults, though fearsome, had often cost the Japanese dearly, leaving them annihilated in days. But on Iwo Jima, something was different. Kuribayashi forbade such charges. To him, they were wasteful, futile eruptions of courage that achieved little but a quick death. His vision was colder, more deliberate. The Americans would not be given the satisfaction of facing enemies who rushed blindly into their guns. Instead, they would be dragged into a long, grinding contest of endurance, one that sapped morale as well as blood. The Japanese became phantoms. At night, small squads infiltrated American lines, slipping silently through the volcanic fog. A Marine might wake to find an enemy soldier crouched in the shadows of his own foxhole, knife drawn. Ammunition dumps were raided under cover of darkness, medical stations harassed, communications severed. Even in rear areas thought to be secure, Marines found themselves under sudden, ghost-like attack. Snipers, hidden in caves or perched high in Suribachi's ridges, picked off men with uncanny patience. A single shot would echo across the beach, followed by hours of silence. The Marines learned to fear even the quiet. Each step forward meant stepping into a zone already sighted by an unseen rifle. What made this resistance even more formidable was the spirit with which it was carried out. First Lieutenant Sugihara Kenryu, a young officer on the island, kept a meticulous diary through the early days of the battle. On February 22nd, he wrote, "This is a winning battle. Be persistent. We must definitely build the foundation of victory for this greater East Asia war." To the Americans, the Japanese seemed doomed. To men like Sugihara, they were fulfilling a sacred mission. The morale of Kuribayashi's soldiers remained remarkably high, even as casualties mounted. Unlike earlier battles where despair led to reckless final charges, Iwo Jima's defenders clung to discipline. They were not fighting merely for a patch of ground, but for the symbolic defense of the homeland itself. Every hour they delayed the Marines was proof to Tokyo that the spirit of Japan was unbroken. For the Americans, this new kind of resistance was maddening. No front line seemed secure. No pillbox stayed silent for long. Even the terrain itself seemed complicit, offering endless hiding places for men who refused to die quickly. It was like fighting the island itself, one Marine later recalled. By the end of the 4th day, the Marines had secured only narrow footholds at a staggering cost. And yet, ahead still loomed Mount Suribachi, its slopes dark and jagged, its tunnels alive with men who were prepared to make the mountain their tomb. For days, Mount Suribachi had loomed over the battlefield like a silent volcanic sentinel. From its slopes, Japanese spotters directed artillery that raked the beaches. Machine guns from hidden apertures spat death onto the sand. The mountain was not merely terrain, it was the eye of the storm, watching every move the Marines made. By February 23rd, American forces had at last managed to isolate the southern tip of the island. The noose tightened around Suribachi, though the mountain itself remained alive with defenders burrowed into its flanks. From the perspective of the Marines below, it was a fortress of stone and fire, each crevice concealing a potential ambush. Yet the order was given: Suribachi must fall. A small patrol from the 28th Regiment began the ascent that morning, moving cautiously up the steep slopes. Every footstep carried the weight of uncertainty. Were the Japanese waiting in ambush? Would a sudden burst of fire sweep them from the rocky face? The Marines clutched their rifles tight, nerves taut as bowstrings, expecting death at every turn. To their astonishment, resistance was lighter than expected. Many of Kuribayashi's men had retreated deeper into tunnels rather than risk open combat. Some would later be killed when the labyrinth beneath the mountain was cleared with flamethrowers and explosives. For the climbers, this eerie quiet was more unnerving than battle. At times, they heard faint voices echoing from inside the rock, unseen enemies whispering through the stone. Hours passed as the patrol crept higher, their boots slipping on volcanic rubble. Behind them, the island stretched out in a haze of smoke. Black sand beaches littered with wreckage, the American fleet anchored offshore, the sounds of battle rolling like distant thunder. To climb Suribachi was to step above the chaos, to glimpse the scale of a fight that seemed endless. Finally, at 10:35 a.m., the Marines reached the summit. In their packs, they carried a small American flag, one taken from a transport ship below. They found a length of pipe, affixed the flag to it, and raised it against the gray sky. For a moment, silence. Then a roar. Ships offshore sounded their horns. Men on the beach cheered. Even wounded Marines lifted themselves from stretchers to glimpse the flag fluttering atop Japanese soil. One Marine, Alvin Orsund, later recalled, "They told us it would all be over in 72 hours. Sure enough, at 10:35 we saw Old Glory flying on the highest point. That's it, we thought. We've done it." But beneath that flag, inside the mountain and across the northern ridges, thousands of Japanese soldiers still lived. Suribachi's capture was a triumph, but it was not the end. For the Americans, it was a symbol of hope. For Kuribayashi, it was simply one position in a battle designed to drain the invaders' blood, inch by inch. The mountain had fallen, but Iwo Jima had not. The flag raised on Suribachi that morning was not meant to be history. It was a small gesture, a signal to those below that the summit had been secured. But war has a way of seizing upon symbols. Later that same day, a second, larger flag was brought up the mountain so that it could be more visible from the beaches. When it was lifted, Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal pressed the shutter of his camera at precisely the right instant. The resulting image, 6 Marines straining together to plant the stars and stripes against the gray volcanic sky, became one of the most famous photographs in American history. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It was reproduced on posters, postage stamps, and eventually immortalized in bronze at the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. For millions back home, it encapsulated the spirit of victory, of sacrifice, of triumph against impossible odds. Yet the reality on Iwo Jima was far more complex. Many Marines at the base of the mountain believed, like Alvin Orsund, that the battle was nearly over when the flag appeared. "We've done it," they thought. But in truth, the island was only half conquered. Thousands of Japanese still held out in the labyrinth of tunnels to the north. For them, the flag on Suribachi was not a symbol of defeat. It was a challenge, a reminder that they still had ground to defend and lives to give. Even among the men in Rosenthal's photograph, tragedy lingered. 3 of the 6 flag raisers would be dead before the battle was over, cut down in the fighting that still raged beyond the mountain. Their image lived on as myth, while their bodies fell into the ash like so many others. The power of the photograph also carried unintended consequences. Back in the United States, the image became the centerpiece of a massive war bond drive. The surviving flag raisers were plucked from the battlefield, flown home, and paraded before cheering crowds. To them, it was bewildering. They had left comrades in the mud of Iwo Jima only to find themselves treated as national heroes. One later confessed that he felt more like a ghost than a victor. War often demands symbols, moments that make sense of the chaos. The flag on Suribachi was one such moment, but it was only part of the story. Beneath the myth lay the unrelenting truth. The battle for Iwo Jima was far from over, and the cost had only begun to mount. With Mount Suribachi secured, many Americans believed the worst was behind them. But for the Marines advancing north, the battle was only entering its most brutal phase. The flat airfields that stretched across the island were now within reach, but beyond them lay ridges, ravines, and fortified hills that the Japanese had turned into killing fields. The terrain itself seemed designed for slaughter. Jagged ridgelines cut across the island, each offering interlocking fields of fire for hidden machine guns. Caves honeycombed the slopes, their openings camouflaged until a burst of fire betrayed them. The Marines gave grim nicknames to these positions: Turkey Knob, Hill 362, and most infamous of all, the Meat Grinder. Here, Kuribayashi's defense was at its most effective. Every strong point was connected to others by tunnels, allowing Japanese troops to vanish underground after an attack, only to reappear behind or beside the advancing Americans. A bunker destroyed in the morning might blaze with new gunfire by afternoon. The effect was maddening, a war against enemies who seemed immortal, their lives renewed by the island itself. Casualties soared. Between February 25th and March 10th, the Marines suffered nearly 12,000 killed or wounded. The 5th Division, advancing along the left flank, was cut to pieces as it stormed one ridge after another. The 3rd Division fought in the center, grinding forward yard by yard through fields of shell craters and shattered rock. On the right flank, the 4th Division battered itself against the Meat Grinder, a complex of pillboxes and tunnels so deadly that some units were reduced to a fraction of their strength within hours. The methods of attack were as brutal as the defense. Flamethrowers belched rivers of fire into caves, the flames sucking oxygen from the tunnels and leaving nothing but silence. Satchel charges and grenades were hurled into dark mouths, their concussions reverberating through the rock. At times, bulldozers were called forward to seal entire cave entrances, burying the defenders alive. It was a campaign fought not only with rifles and courage, but with fire, earth, and suffocation. For the Marines, it was a test of endurance unlike anything they had faced. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Entire days were fought for the gain of a single ridge. Men who had stormed Suribachi now found themselves clawing through terrain that offered no triumphs, only exhaustion. One Marine later described it as a slow, grinding nightmare where death was always at your elbow. And still, they pressed forward. Commanders rotated units as best they could, pulling battered regiments out of the line and feeding in reinforcements. But even fresh troops quickly learned that there was no safe place on Iwo Jima. Every cave, every rise of ground, every shadow seemed to conceal an enemy waiting to kill. In the Meat Grinder, the myth of a quick victory died. What remained was the grim reality. Iwo Jima would devour men until the last Japanese soldier fell, and that day was still far away. For weeks, Kuribayashi's discipline had held. Unlike earlier island battles, there had been no wild suicidal charges against American lines. His men had fought from their tunnels, conserving lives, trading ground for blood. But on the night of March 8th, that restraint cracked. One Japanese commander, unable to bear the slow erosion of his garrison, chose the old path of the warrior, a banzai charge. As the moon rose over the ridges, nearly 800 men gathered in the darkness. Some carried rifles, others bayonets, still others clutched grenades or swords. They knew the order was against their general's wishes, but to them, death in a final glorious rush was preferable to suffocating in caves or starving in silence. At midnight, the charge erupted. The Japanese surged forward with cries of "Tenoheika Banzai! Long live the Emperor!" Their voices echoing across the shattered island. They rushed headlong into the American positions, a tide of shadows against the flickering light of flares. For the Marines on the line, the sudden onslaught was both terrifying and surreal, a reminder of earlier campaigns thought left behind. The clash was ferocious. Marines fired rifles and machine guns until barrels glowed, cut down attackers in swaths, only to see new waves pressing through the smoke. Grenades arced in both directions, their explosions mingling with screams and shouted orders. In some sectors, the fighting collapsed into hand-to-hand struggle, bayonets and entrenching tools wielded in the chaos. By dawn, the ground was littered with bodies. Of the 800 Japanese who had hurled themselves at the American lines, 784 lay dead. The Americans counted 347 casualties, men killed or wounded in the sudden violence. The defenders had bought nothing but their own annihilation. For Kuribayashi, the charge was a bitter disappointment. He had believed in conserving every life, every bullet, every moment of resistance to drag the battle into weeks. The banzai charge had undone that logic in a single night, yet it also revealed the cultural weight of honor and sacrifice that many of his men still clung to. To die rushing forward, screaming the emperor's name, was for them a fulfillment of duty, even if tactically meaningless. For the Marines, it was another lesson in the merciless nature of this campaign. Even in the face of inevitable defeat, the Japanese would not yield. Every cave, every ridge, every squad of survivors could erupt in sudden fury. There would be no easy victories on Iwo Jima, only the slow grind until the last defender fell. After the failed banzai charge, the battle shifted once more into Kuribayashi's grim design, a war of shadows. The northern ridges of Iwo Jima still bristled with hidden fortifications, and within them lurked thousands of Japanese soldiers who seemed less like men than phantoms, appearing, vanishing, reappearing from the earth itself. The Marines pressed forward with grim determination, but every gain was haunted. A hill captured in daylight might suddenly come alive with gunfire at dusk, defenders having slipped back through tunnels unseen. A trench thought secure erupted with grenades tossed from an opening no one had noticed. The enemy was not merely stubborn, they were spectral, woven into the very bones of the island. The methods used to root them out were brutal. Flamethrowers became the weapon of choice, their searing streams of fire forced into cave mouths, sucking oxygen from chambers and leaving behind silence and ash. Explosives were rolled into tunnel entrances, their blasts thundering through unseen corridors. Bulldozers sealed openings, burying defenders alive in their labyrinth. Yet even then, the Marines could never be certain that the enemy was gone. "You never killed them all," one Marine later recalled. "You just drove them deeper." The psychological toll was immense. Sleep was scarce. A foxhole dug near a rocky outcrop might conceal a passage below, its occupants listening all night to muffled footsteps beneath their position. Even the dead seemed to resist. Many Japanese soldiers refused to surrender, pulling grenades to their chests when cornered. The Marines, hardened by years of combat, confessed that Iwo Jima left them shaken in ways no other island had. Amid this darkness, the courage of ordinary men shone grimly. Corpsmen crawled through fire to reach the wounded, sometimes fighting hand-to-hand beside the men they came to save. Marines advanced yard by yard through a landscape of sulfurous rock, knowing that every cave might be their last. They fought not only against the enemy, but against the exhaustion of a campaign that offered no glory, only survival. For the Japanese, life underground grew steadily worse. Supplies dwindled, water became precious, food scarce. In some tunnels, the wounded lay beside the living, the smell of decay heavy in the air. Still, discipline held. Orders from Kuribayashi urged persistence, silence, and the will to fight until the final breath. His soldiers endured in the dark, convinced that every day they delayed the Americans was a victory for Japan itself. To the Marines above, it felt like battling ghosts, unseen, unyielding, and unending. The island seemed alive with whispers of defiance, each cave a mouth from which death might speak. Iwo Jima was no longer just a battlefield. It was a haunted place, and its phantoms would not rest until the last stone was turned to ash. By mid-March, the battle for Iwo Jima had become a war of attrition. The Marines had carved their way across the island, taking one ridge after another, but at a staggering price. The Japanese garrison, once 21,000 strong, had been whittled down to only a few hundred survivors scattered through the tunnels. Yet Kuribayashi still lived, or so many believed, and his spirit lingered in the men who followed his oath. On the night of March 25th, as the Americans consolidated their hold around Airfield Number 2, the silence of exhaustion settled over the island. Marines slumped in their foxholes, weapons within arm's reach, some drifting into uneasy sleep. They thought the battle was nearly over. Then, just after midnight, the shadows moved. Roughly 300 Japanese soldiers, gaunt, desperate, but still disciplined, emerged from their tunnels and crept toward the airfield. Some carried rifles, others grenades. A few clutched bayonets lashed to bamboo poles. They had no illusions of survival. Their purpose was simple: to spill as much American blood as possible in one final act of defiance. The attack fell like a nightmare. Japanese soldiers slipped among the tents and foxholes, stabbing Marines in their sleep, hurling grenades into supply dumps. Fires erupted as fuel stores ignited. Confusion reigned. Men scrambled from their blankets into chaos, grabbing rifles and firing wildly into the dark. The night became a maelstrom of screams, explosions, and sudden flashes of bayonets glinting in the firelight. For 90 minutes, hand-to-hand combat raged across the airfield. Marines fought with rifles, knives, and even their fists. Corpsmen defended their patients inside aid stations, some wielding scalpels when ammunition ran out. One survivor remembered it as pure chaos, shadows rushing, gunfire in every direction, and the certainty that you might not see dawn. At last, the counterattack stabilized. Marines rallied, pushing the Japanese back toward the broken ridges. When morning came, the ground around Airfield Number 2 was littered with bodies, nearly every one of the attackers slain. American losses numbered more than 100 dead and wounded. The Japanese, as always, had fought to extinction. Rumors spread among the Marines that Kuribayashi himself had led the assault, charging at the head of his men before vanishing into the dark. No proof was ever found. His body was never definitively identified. Perhaps he had died with his men in that last furious attack. Perhaps he perished quietly in the tunnels, his end as hidden as his strategy. Either way, his presence haunted the field. The attack felt less like a military action than the last heartbeat of a garrison that had sworn to resist to the very end. When dawn broke on March 26th, the island was finally declared secure. But the Marines who had survived the night knew the truth. There had been nothing secure about that darkness. Iwo Jima's final breath had been violent, intimate, and unforgettable. At sunrise on March 26, 1945, the guns of Iwo Jima at last fell silent. After 36 days of unrelenting combat, the island was officially declared secure. The announcement was brief, almost clinical. The operation completed, objective achieved. Yet for those who had endured the Black Sands, there was nothing simple about this victory. The Marines who emerged from foxholes and craters that morning did so like men stepping out of the underworld. They were gaunt, ash-streaked, eyes hollow from weeks without real rest. Around them lay the evidence of the cost: twisted tanks, blasted pillboxes, the wreckage of landing craft half buried in volcanic sand. And everywhere, the bodies, some hastily covered, others still lying where they had fallen, reminders that this tiny island had become a graveyard for thousands. The statistics told part of the story. The United States had suffered over 28,000 casualties on Iwo Jima, including nearly 7,000 dead. For the Marines, it was a staggering toll. Roughly 1/3 of all losses the Corps sustained in the entire Second World War. The Japanese garrison of 21,000 was virtually annihilated. Barely 200 were taken prisoner, most of them too wounded to continue fighting. The rest had chosen death, whether by bullet, by fire, or by grenade clutched to their chest. And yet, amid the ruin, there was a grim sense of accomplishment. Iwo Jima had been secured not by luck, not by overwhelming firepower alone, but by endurance. The Marines had faced an enemy who asked no quarter and gave none, an island that seemed determined to devour them whole, and still they had prevailed. Among the Americans who served on Iwo, Admiral Nimitz would later remark, uncommon valor was a common virtue, but for the men who lived it, valor felt less like glory and more like survival. Letters written in the days after spoke of relief, of grief, of numb exhaustion. Some could not bring themselves to describe what they had seen. Others admitted that they no longer felt human, as if the island had stripped away something essential. For the Japanese, Iwo Jima was not simply a loss, but a sacrifice. Their commanders in Tokyo lauded the garrison for fulfilling its duty to the emperor, for buying precious time with their lives. For Kuribayashi, who vanished into the tunnels and whose body was never definitively identified, the end was silence. His plan had succeeded in one sense. He had forced the Americans to pay dearly for every inch of volcanic ground. When the American flag flew above the island on March 26th, it marked not only the capture of territory, but the conclusion of one of the most costly battles in American history. The Black Sands had been won, but at a price that could never be measured in statistics alone. In the weeks that followed, Iwo Jima became a paradox, both a triumph and a wound. On one hand, the American flag flying from Suribachi and the eventual capture of the island were celebrated as proof that even Japan's most fortified bastion could be taken. On the other, the staggering human cost raised a haunting question. Was it worth it? Strategically, Iwo Jima did serve its purpose. Its airfields, once repaired, became lifelines for American air power. More than 2,200 B-29 bombers made emergency landings there in the final months of the war, saving the lives of an estimated 24,000 airmen. Fighters based on the island later escorted bombing raids deep into Japan, reducing losses and tightening the noose around the homeland. To military planners, these facts justified the price. But among Marines who had fought there, the calculus was less clear. They remembered the men swallowed by the ash, the screams echoing through tunnels, the friends buried beneath makeshift crosses. Many felt that the island had been a Pyrrhic prize, its value real, but bought at a cost too steep to reconcile. "We secured a rock," one survivor later said, "but left too many of our brothers behind." The Japanese, too, viewed the battle with a conflicted pride. Official propaganda hailed Kuribayashi and his men as heroes who had delayed the enemy and honored the emperor with their sacrifice. Yet privately, even Japanese leaders knew the garrison's fate had been sealed from the start. Their endurance had been extraordinary, but it had not changed the outcome of the war. In the decades that followed, the memory of Iwo Jima lived on in symbols more than strategy. The flag raising on Suribachi became an icon, immortalized in bronze at Arlington. The phrase spoken by Admiral Nimitz, "Uncommon valor was a common virtue," entered the lexicon of American memory. For Japan, Kuribayashi was remembered with an unusual respect, even by his former enemies, for his discipline and humanity in the midst of destruction. Yet beneath these symbols, the island remains haunted. The Black Sands still hold the bones of thousands who never left, Marines who never returned home, and Japanese soldiers who chose to die where they stood. Iwo Jima is, in every sense, a cemetery without walls. In the end, the controversy endures because the battle itself was both necessary and tragic, both decisive and devastating. It revealed the extremes of human courage and the depths of human loss. It was, as history would remember it, one of the bloodiest and most costly small battles in all of human warfare. The island that once seemed so insignificant became a crucible, a place where two nations clashed not only with steel and fire, but with willpower and belief. And in that crucible, thousands gave their lives so that others might see a flag raised against the sky.